So the beginnings of we're going to be talking a little bit of the chronological. So one of the first things is the cultures of the Indus Valley. That's very, very important. It's sort of where everything begins, right? This Indus Valley, this is where we sort of start getting the name, right? India, and so uh, and this was 3000 before the Common Era. So a very, very long time ago. One of the biggest problems in this area, and this is going to be one of your questions, and it's going to be in your quiz later on. It has to do with flooding, right? So one of the biggest things that happened in this era and in this area was flooding, right? Those of you who know Spanish, right? Indus kind of reminds you or reminds me of inundación in Indu, and so that's one way you can think about it if you are familiar with Spanish, right? Indu and inundaciones, maybe that's I'm always looking for ways to connect to make it easier for me to remember things, right? So that's one way I think about it, right? And then we're gonna go into you know different eras, different buildings, eventually getting into this big religious you know uh, person, which is Buddha, right? And that really changes a lot of the architecture, changes a lot of the symbols. And then we're going to start going into the Great Stupa, and then finally finish with Angkor Wat, which is this huge, huge building. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to be seeing a little bit of a couple of buildings, a couple of videos. So the first one we're going to watch is really quickly is just explains a little bit of the Indus Valley civilization. So it'll be like a couple of minutes. I do have it here ready. So let me know if you can hear this or not.
The earliest civilizations we have found have been around river
Can y'all hear
valleys.
it?
And that is no
Okay.
coincidence because some of the first agriculture emerged around river valleys, and the agriculture supported higher population densities and more sedentary populations and allowed for more specialization. And we have talked about several of these, the ancient Egyptians around the Nile River, the ancient Mesopotamians around the Tigris and Euphrates. And now we're going to talk about the ancient civilization around the Indus River. The Indus River runs mostly in modern day Pakistan, and that's why it's called the Indus Valley Civilization. Indus Valley Civilization. Civilization. It's also sometimes referred to as the Harappan civilization, which was the first site where they found evidence of this fairly extensive civilization. Now, to get ourselves acquainted in time, this shows when archaeologists, historians consider to be the main part of the Harappan civilization. There's evidence that people had basic villages, civilizations, agriculture here as far back as 7,000 BCE, and that's just based on the evidence we have today. But when people refer to the Indus Valley civilization in particular, they're usually starting around 3300 BCE. And in orange right over here, this is the early period, or you could say the early Indus Valley civilization. Now, some of the biggest structures and the pieces of technology that have been discovered have been right over here, which is often referred to as the mature period for the Indus Valley civilization. And then it goes into decline. We'll talk about why it might have gone into decline, although we're not really sure. And this is called the late. Now, to put it in context relative to these other civilizations, remember the ancient Sumerians were starting to be quite, I guess you could say, civilized by about this period. You start having a lot of intermingling between the Akkadians and the Sumerians. As you get into the late third millennium, that's when you have the empire of Sargon the Great, the Akkadian Empire. As you get to the end of this mature period right over here, this is close to or around the time of Hammurabi, the Babylonian Empire. And in Egypt, if you go back to around.
All right, so I just wanted you to kind of locate it a little bit. One of the big things that they mentioned, one of the things is very similar to the Egyptian architecture. There's usually, in most eras, there's usually what we call the early, the middle, and the late, right? Usually the early is, it's the beginning when they're barely starting to discovered things, or they're barely starting to become a city. In the middle is usually the high point, right? And usually, or sometimes even the early could be also the high point. And then the late is usually always sort of the big decline, right? And it's that big transition of one era to another era, or one style of architecture, or one civilization taking over. So usually the late era is usually when another country or another empire takes over, right? And I want you to start thinking like that as we move forward, right? What is the high period? What is the big moment in this chapter that I'm looking into, and what is sort of the decline, and what happened? Why did it decline, right? That's always the big question that we sometimes have an answer, sometimes we have ideas, but it's interesting for you all to start, thinking as an architectural historian in that way, right? So we looked a little bit about in the area, and so one of the big things that also wanted to mention is this sort of synergy of different ideas coming together, right? So during these times, as we move forward, there's going to be a lot of mixture of ideas. We saw that in the video. In the video, we talked about the Sumerians and the Akkadians, right? Sumerians were those who developed the very early stages of writing. Um, and so now we're starting to see or think about the idea of how different cultures, different ideologies, different religions can come together and start merging, and either conflicts arise because of this, or mixtures and new things can start also coming out of this. So this is, as we move forward, that is also a big part of the architecture itself, right? So we start getting different kinds of shrines, or different kinds of religious temples that start to come out of this. We do have what they call the Brahmins, which is a powerful priest. So this is also important for you to know. This sort of becomes a sort of like a linealogy, sort of a type of families that are sort of born into this, and it becomes also a lot of where they live, what kind of architecture they have, and things like that, right? And until this day, I do believe there's still sort of that linealogy that has been followed, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the religions that started to emerge was Hinduism, which is sort of the religion of the Brahms that eventually, just evolved from the original religion that they had. And also what we talked about, Buddhism, which is really, really, really going to be big also as we move into other Asia architecture, such as Japan. So it's going to be really, really important to remember, Buddha and its architecture. And then the last thing is going to be Jainism. So this is sort of inspired by this, story and this life of Vardhamana. And so another thing that I need you to understand, that there's going to be a lot of deities. So they're going to have a lot of different sort of gods, being represented. We're coming from the Greek era, which we kind of know this mythology of Zeus and things like that. So we know already that there's a lot of different deities, or sort of gods and demigods, right? And so something similar is happening here. And so I remember traveling not to India, but they did have a temple with many of these deities, and they don't allow you to take any pictures. But it was all these different representations in stone of all these deities, and it was like hundreds and hundreds. It was this hallway on both sides of hundreds and hundreds of deities, and it was just again coming more from not having not visited something like that. It is something that's really impressive to see, right? Just the detail in every single one of these sculptures. So as we move forward, we're going to look. One of the big things I do want you to look into is the stupa. So the stupa, it's one of the questions going to mention that what kind of shape, and it's a dome shape. And so this is the idea again of corbelling and things like that. And it also looks a lot like the mound that we saw earlier, right? That sort of tomb that we saw from our previous chapters, right? And so we started looking into these shapes that look very, very organic, very rock shaped, very like mountains. So their idea of connecting things to sort of stones or mountain is very, very important, right? Because that's where they believe, or that's where they represent or symbolize that they've had, their deed is living in this sort of mountains. And so they try to bring that into their sort of lifestyle. And so let's look at this video about the stupa real quick.
Point in early Buddhism for a monastic complex was the stupa. A stupa takes the form usually of a hemispherical mound, and what it represents is the burial mound of the Buddha, within which his relics would have been deposited. Stupas could also have enclosed the relics of great Buddhist teachers and monks.
Stupas also take the form of small containers or reliquaries, such as these stone or metal stupas in the collection of the Asian Art Museum. These would have contained the ashes of a deceased person. Stupas appear as a focal point of worship in a number of the Buddhist rock-cut sanctuaries at Ajanta and Ellora. One of the best examples of an early stupa can still be seen at Sanchi in central India. Perched on a hill, the Great Stupa is surrounded by monastic ruins and several smaller stupas. It was built some 2,000 years ago. 4 gateways were later added, marking the cardinal directions. Worshippers entered through these gateways and then walked around the stupa in a clockwise direction. The hemispherical mound was undecorated, while the gateways were elaborately carved with many scenes and figures. For example, on this gateway, the worshipper sees a voluptuous figure holding on to a fruit-bearing tree.
Buddhism made use of these types of fertility deities because they had to appeal to popular taste. And so they absorbed many of these local fertility deities into their pantheon. And images such as this were considered highly auspicious, may have served to delineate the transition between sacred and secular space, as well as sanctify the site. A similar image in the Asian Art Museum galleries from a railing pillar probably served in much the same way. The gateways here at Sanchi also contain narrative scenes, but the Buddha is never depicted in human form. His presence is indicated in this relief, for instance, by emblems of royalty like the umbrella above the horse, or by his footprints. In scenes of worship, the image of the wheel or of the stupa appear to stand for the Buddha himself. So his presence is indicated by these symbols.
As Buddhism spread throughout Asia, the shape of the stupa and its decoration evolved as an architectural form. In East Asia, for example, the base of the stupa tended to become taller and taller, and to add more levels, like a tower. These new, sometimes unusual forms of the stupa continued to serve as relic chambers, and as symbols of the Buddha and his teachings.
All right, so that is the stupa, and so one of the big things that hopefully you took from this, right? It's a couple of things. One, the stupa itself, right? it could vary in form, right? So I don't want you all to just, oh, stupa is this mound, this sort of dome-looking thing, right? This is the Great Stupa, right? This specific one, right? But it could vary in shape, in form, right? We'll start seeing eventually. You saw some of more like vertical stacked, right? The second thing that's very important for you to remember is that it's holding one, that it's for Buddhists, and second, that it's holding some sort of reliquary, so some sort of symbolic or object that will connect to, that has some sort of spiritual connection to the people worshiping in this place, right? So in a way, people from around the world or around the cities will come because, oh, they have the this that the Buddha had. They have something from the Buddha that used to belong to Buddha, right? And so nowadays, it's not, when we talk about stupa, it's not also an architectural element. It could also be something smaller, right? Something more that, when we think about it, it's more like an for this ash container for when some people are cremated, right? Something like that. Now it also becomes some sort of reliquary to keep some sort of remains of people. So stupa becomes sort of the symbolic idea of things. But what did you all think of the sort of the design of the overall? Did anyone have any? Did you all like it, of some of the carvings that they had all around? What did you all think?
Must have taken them quite a while to do all those carvings. I see that because I skimmed through the chapter, but there's going to be a lot of that, and people dedicated their lives just to doing that.
Yeah.
They're very ornate, very detailed.
Exactly. So it's as you mentioned, people dedicated time, life, like weeks, months, years, to do something this detailed, right? And it's all because, as you mentioned, why would it take so much time? Because you're honoring your deity. You're not just doing this for men, right? There's a spiritual connection. It's something much higher than just for yourself, right? And so the level of detail in it's really, really sort of like a gift or a sacrifice to this God, right? And so, as a sort of like a religious gift. So look at all the detail that they have, and so most of these are very earth tone colors. Again, bringing back to that idea, there might have been a little bit more color, but most of these is just looks kind of like it fades into nature, kind of just fades into, there was other stones and things like that. From a distance, maybe you would just see like this huge piece of like a hill or something, right? So it's sort of all just sort of blending in or going back into the earth, right? So, but yeah, the level of detail, I want you to, when you see this, you're like, okay, this is Southeast Asia, India architecture. So the other thing that I did mention earlier was the fact of the Hindu temples and the principles, right? So it goes back to the idea of not just details in an ornate way, right? But also in a symbolic meaning, right? So, as I mentioned, they do venerate multitudes of deities. So there's a lot of so not just one, and it's not just for, it becomes not just for dwelling, but also for objects of worship. So it's sort of this combination of a temple, combination with dwelling, combination for a holding something precious. And so most of these temples, they include forms that are symbolic to the holy mountain, which we talked about before, the sacred cave, which again we talked about before, and the cosmic axis. And one of the big things is this idea of the mandala. Again, this is very important for you to remember this idea of how they divide these squares. So it's sort of an illustration of how most Hindu temples are divided. I do have another sort of example here, and you can see how, the idea of geometry is sort of pushing the design itself, right? We have the triangles representing man, female, and male, the sort of the universe, the space, and all of that becomes really, translated into the architecture itself, right? It kind of seems very abstract in a way when we look at some things like these, right? But in reality, it's all based on this sort of um, enlightenment and architectural geometry, this sacred geometry, what they call it. So here you can start seeing the Brahmas. We talked about these priests, and then different squares. All of it is following a specific, very specific pattern, right? And if you're really interested into math and numbers, there's a lot of videos and articles on the sacred geometry, and it's really, really, really interesting. If that's something that you're sort of interested in, maybe you didn't really you were not interested in architecture, but now you're like, oh, maybe that would be fun to look into, right? So now that we're talking about temples, let's watch this video. As I mentioned, there's going to be a couple of videos, so now let's watch this video regarding temples.
Hindu temples can be seen throughout the villages, towns, and cities of India. A temple can be a simple structure by the side of the road or an entire complex of buildings. Regardless of its size, the Hindu temple is essentially a dwelling place for the gods. A principal deity resides at the heart of each temple, like a king or queen in their palace. Other deities, attendants, and mythical figures can also be seen as part of the temple structure. Surrounding the temple are stalls selling offerings and souvenirs such as fruit, flowers, sweets, and postcards. The atmosphere around the temple is lively and boisterous. The interior of a Hindu temple is not designed to hold large congregations. Worshippers come and go in small groups through a hallway leading to an inner sanctuary. Here, the image or symbol of the main deity is located. In an active temple, statues of the deities are covered with garlands and draped with rich fabrics. Above the sanctuary rises a central tower, often brightly painted. The shape of the tower resembles the mythical mountain home of the gods. Other features of temples include sacred bathing ponds, walled enclosures, and gateways in a variety of shapes and sizes. Here, at Madurai in southern India, the gateways tower above the temple complex and are covered with statues. Some temples are no longer in active use. At Khajuraho in central India, Tourists now flock to see celebrated images of gods and loving couples adorning the exterior walls. In Konark, near the eastern coast, are the remains of one of the largest temples ever built in India. It was dedicated to the sun god Surya. The original tower no longer survives, and we can only imagine its size from the smaller buildings that still stand. The immense variety of temples throughout India is the result of local styles and preferences and centuries of architectural developments. Each attests to the artistry of countless masons and sculptors. The sculptures of deities seen in the Asian Art Museum were once part of an active Hindu temple. They adorned the exterior walls, interior spaces, entranceways, high wall niches, and inner sanctuaries.
All right. What do y'all think of these temples? What stands out? What doesn't? What do you all? Does anyone? How would y'all? What does it resemble? What do y'all think about these? And as the video mentioned, right? They talked about temples, right? And they said there's just different kinds of temples. So they carve a lot of. I think we got a comment. They carve a lot of women and men in the walls. Yeah, so they do a lot of sort of representation of people, animals, deities, right? And so yeah, but it does almost seem the amount of art is really very, very detailed, and it's impressive. And it almost just seems like it's this mountain, like that's why I kind of like this one, because it's a cave temple at Udalgari, India, and it almost just seems like it's this cave coming alive, or just this cave exploding into a building, right? And it's just really amazing to see, because it's not, we usually just think of, let's bring wood and let's make things, right? But this is like, hey, let's get this cave and let's start carving, let's start cutting and creating something out of this, right? Again, caves, mountains, all of these have this very important representation to them. And so if they already have this representation that they want it to look like a mountain, then it's even better when you already have some sort of cave or rock structure there, and you just bring it back to life, right? So again, if let's say for some reason you're flying and your flight, you get lost and you land in this place and you just see this cave temple at a distance, right? How would you feel? Like what would you think is inside? Like it kind of seems like one of those Indiana Jones movies or something, right? Like there's probably some secret treasure or something inside, right? But it's again, it's this, and all of these rock features just coming in. And also something like this. It's called Temple 17 at Saki, India. You can see a little bit of the Greek, right, that we've seen before, sort of the cella inside, this sort of entrance. Maybe you would expect an altar going back to the other one. But this one, right, this is not like any of the Corinthian, Ionic, Doric columns, Tuscan columns that we've seen, right? This is a completely same concept, same idea, same purpose, but it's completely different, right? It has a bit more of a square base, then it starts changing, then it becomes more ornate and round and organic, then it has a, this sort of top, and this complete different, also with imagery sitting right on the top, right? So it's completely different to what we were seeing before. And also you start seeing a lot more stone again. So this big idea, and so size varies, right? Because again, in the Greek architecture, we started seeing that most temples or all these looked not extremely similar, but you can see this order, right? We talked about Greek was all about order, but when we move away from that, it's more about representation here. It's more about what you have at hand and how the amount of people that you have, and what can you do with those, right? Talked another one of these temples. So again, we talked about caves, and so these builders, they really became very skillful at working with stones, sometimes brick, right? And so another one of these is this, right? This is the Lat Khan temple, and you can see again, it just seems like stones placed over one over another, right? And again, you do start getting to see a lot of the details here, and all the structure, but it just seems again like a huge stone cut in places to create a home, right? Or create a temple, or create some sort of dwelling. The temples eventually, they do start getting higher. So that's one of the things that we're going to start seeing as we move forward. They're really this idea of verticality. So the higher you go, the closer you're to, the cosmos, to your deity. So this idea of building higher, it's really not just in Southeast Asia, but in other religions, we'll start seeing this a lot more. But again, we see the very, very similar idea. It seems more like a sculpture, right? It seems more than a temple. It seems like some sort of sculpture that you just see in a park or a street, right? Look at that detail. Look at how precise and everything. It just seems like it's being carved out of a stone, right? So we're going to end with these other temples. So there's look at that. It's just really, 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 really impressive, right? And each of them telling a story, each of them representing something, each of them, unique and different, all of those following a sort of geometric religious pattern. And so every single, it's, if you ever seen any of this in person, I promise you, you won't even know where to look, right? It's so overwhelming. It magnifies everything. You're just like overwhelmed by this architecture that you kind of feel close to it, and it makes you want to touch it, but it also makes you revere it and push back and be like, I don't know if I can touch this, because it's just such an amazing work of art, right? So this is the Kandaraya Mahadeva temple, and the last one that we'll see here in this page is the Dharmara Rata. And again, very, very, and you can start seeing again, there's not a lot of order such as the Greek architecture, right? It's just, they're even using kind of different styles of roofs. They do start using a lot of the arches, so that's something that's also important, that they start using these corbelling arches. So that's very important for you to know as well. It's going to be in your questions, but you can start seeing how the columns, they vary, and they each representing again, there's so many deities, there's so many religious ideas that they want to represent. So each temple starts taking its own thing, right? Usually when you see temples like these, usually the highest is always where the god, lives. So again, thinking about a mountain, usually at the highest point is where their god is. So something very, very similar. You'll start seeing this sort of like mountain type looking, and usually the highest will always be where deity resides. So you start seeing that again happening over and over again. The last one I want us to see is Angkor Wat, which is this huge, huge, huge complex, right? I want you to think about it as a city within a city within a city, right? It's a temple within a city within a city. So there's different. It's just one big place, but there's so much different buildings and structures and things going on, right? That it's really so complex, right? The main thing is this big temple at the center. And so one of the big things that it is believed is that it's very, very similar to the pyramid, that this centerpiece was supposed to be a place where um, who was reigning at this time, before he died, he needed to finish building this so that his remains could be buried there and that he can have access to eternity, right? So very similar to the pyramids. It took a lot of engineering to be able to build this because it is surrounded by a lot of water. And so it was, as you can see, there's water all around it. So the water made the thing, the land move a lot. So, they had to really figure out how to build this in order for it not to fall due to the constant change of land because of the water, right? And so, again, you can start seeing different levels or different sort of mounds or different spires coming out. And this is going to be also something that we'll start seeing as we move forward, right? But always the center, or always the big, the main one is where the importance is, right? And also we start playing a lot with the idea of symmetry. So that's something I haven't mentioned, but in this idea, even though it's very, very abstract, because there's geometry involved, there's symmetry, right? So you can literally cut this in half, right? And you would get, the same thing on both sides. So the idea of symmetry becomes very, very important because we're dealing with geometry, we're dealing with sacred numbers. Nothing is just random. Everything has to follow a certain pattern and logic, even though there's no order in the sense that everyone has to do the same, but they do follow a very strict geometric idea. So let's watch this last video and we'll be done for today. It's 5 minutes and we'll be done a little early today. So
The ancient kingdom of Angkor was one of the most powerful states in Southeast Asia from the 800s to the 1300s. A succession of kings built huge temples that survive today as some of the world's greatest religious monuments. The kings at Angkor adopted Hindu and Buddhist beliefs from India and combined these with local beliefs in sacred mountains, ancestors, and nature spirits. Temples were filled with images of the gods, especially Shiva and Vishnu, as well as scenes from Hindu mythology. Temples were built to resemble the sacred mountain home of the gods, and they were surrounded by vast moats, suggesting the cosmic ocean. These temple mountains stood at the heart of the capital and were calculated to approximate the plan of the universe as it was understood in the Hindu-Buddhist worldview. The largest temple of all was Angkor Wat, a vast complex rising toward 5 central towers. These towers were surrounded by 3 enclosures. Along the walls
were scenes from the Indian epics. In this relief, gods and demons churn the primeval ocean by tugging on a giant serpent. Their actions producing various treasures. The last great Angkor king was Jayavarman VII. He drove out the Chams, who invaded from their lands in what is now southern Vietnam. An ardent Buddhist, he launched a massive building program. His great monument was the city of Angkor Thom, with the Bayon Temple at its heart. Here, we enter the temple by the south gate, along an avenue of statues carrying a mythological serpent. Over the gate is a tower with 4 faces looking in the cardinal directions. These enigmatic faces appear throughout the Bayon Temple. Their exact meaning is still debated by scholars. The king's military exploits are commemorated along the many gallery walls of the temple. Other scenes offer glimpses into the life of the city at its height. A Chinese emissary in the late 1200s observed that
these are the monuments that have caused merchants from overseas to speak so often of Cambodia, the rich and noble.
While some temples, such as Angkor Wat, never fell out of use, others have been consumed by the jungle and are in a state of ruin. Today, tourists flock to see these monuments. Efforts are being made to reassemble some temples and stabilize others, so that future generations may continue to enjoy the wonders of Angkor.
All right. So, I think there's one. I think, is it this one? Let me see. Yeah, I think this was the one. This
Including forested areas and newly discovered
is
suburbs,
one more video.
Angkor covers more than 400 square miles, an area considerably larger than New York City's 5 boroughs. And the massive Angkor Wat is the most famed of all Cambodia's temples. It even appears on the nation's flag. The temples are architectural masterpieces, laden with artistic treasures, like the bas-relief galleries that tell enduring tales of Cambodian history and legend. Angkor is as much about water as it is about stone. The site boasts an enormous system of artificial canals, dikes, and reservoirs. These massive works skillfully harnessed river and rainwater to quench the thirst of some 750,000 residents in the world's largest pre-industrial city. It's still a mystery to scientists why the city's rulers abandoned the site. The town of Siem Reap is the gateway to Angkor and is filled with lodging, dining, and tour package options for all budgets. The airport in Siem Reap has service to the capital and regular flights to nearby countries. Those preferring to travel by boat can also make the trip from Phnom Penh in 5 or 6 hours, about the same time as by road. Peak tourist season in Angkor is December and January. when rainfall is less likely and the climate is most kind. No matter the time of year, a visit to Angkor is sure to leave you awestruck.